What is our
Yeah.
time for?
Oh, right. So the episode itself came out, or the interview itself came out at 27:06.
Okay, let me just look that over then. I could
Because I
find.
forgot I had a false start at the beginning, which I pulled up, excuse me, for a blooper, which I'm going to use for. There's so much, like, I've been trying to really, like, in addition to everything else, like pull out more social media clips because I stopped doing it because I got overwhelmed. And I'm trying to get back to that so that I can relaunch the individual pages and then just start dumping all of this stuff there.
Just find
Just more
one
work to do
sheets.
because there isn't enough work to do. All right, well, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Yeah, so Dominic, I have been getting a lot of emails lately.
Oh, do tell.
Yeah, well, they're not like fun emails. They're like rejection emails. So,
Well,
so as per the requirements of the Department of Labor, to prove that I am making an effort to get a job in the most, and what in my opinion is the most futile way possible, and that is applying for jobs. Because at this point, I think most people understand applying is not how you get jobs. Like connections, relationships, all that other stuff.
right,
Also, being in the right place at the right time, that's how you get a job, not
right.
through applying. But whatever, unemployment's like you have to apply for jobs. So I do that. And I will say it's nice that I've been getting rejection letters simply because at least you read what I sent you or you were acknowledging that I applied. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
them are boilerplate. So again, maybe the AI bot went through my stuff and was just like, no. Um, but yeah, so I've been getting quite a few responses that are just like, you know, no. And I don't know, like
Well, how does
what?
it make you feel? I mean, I listen. I've gotten my fair share, obviously, and I'm not
Well, I mean, first
working
of all,
right now
this is a
either.
definitely a kind of business where you have to have a thick skin. It's just, I guess what it is that's weird for me is that there was a time where this much rejection would have started to send me into a spiral and oh my God, and maybe I shouldn't be doing this, and I'm on the wrong track, and what have I done with my life? And oh my God, let's start all over again. And now, I'm just like, that wasn't the job for me.
Yeah, I think especially at this point, like you were saying, in our careers, but also in this market, you understand there's a lot. I mean, either some places have, I mean, as we've discussed before too, some jobs like you see are put on their job ads put out there, but then sometimes they're not hiring actually.
Or they're hiring internally.
Or they're hiring internally, or
And you
sometimes
legally have to put those jobs up, even if you already know who your hire is.
exactly. So it can be frustrating. I had seen something on LinkedIn where it was someone was saying they had a good interaction with a company. Um, they actually had mentioned it was Spotify, which surprised me because like sometimes you get the impression larger companies do not have the capacity to like, you that's just my personal thing is like you think a larger company would end up ignoring someone's, resume, but they were like they actually sent them something and it was positive, like we're gonna we're really sorry we couldn't, do
Mhm.
anything this time, but we'd love to. I'm like, so it helps, I think, for places
I've
when we're
gotten some of
talking about
those as well. I do want to, make positive points here that I have gotten some of those just like, we were really impressed with what you sent us. It just wasn't the right fit. And at this point, I'm kind of like, dude, I get it.
I think I'm cool when it feels like the people actually have given you the chance, have looked over your resumes,
Yes.
or the fact that they even acknowledge, because some places again do not even acknowledge. And it's really frustrating when you're out there applying and you don't even hear back. You
Well,
don't even know
that's
if
why
it,
I'm
it
saying, as weird as it is, I actually appreciate the rejection letters. At
yeah,
least it's some sort of like acknowledging of my
yeah,
humanity,
I agree.
which is now the bar is in Hades officially, because at this point, just acknowledge I'm human and I exist.
I exist. That's it.
Yeah.
We're easily, well, somewhat easily. Uh, we appreciate the acknowledgement. So yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Um, do we want to get to the headlines?
We sure do. And there's quite a few pulled out this week, right?
There are. Um, I guess we'll start off with one which is kind of a follow-up to last week's, where
Yeah, when I first saw this, I was like, wait, didn't we do this last week? And Dom's like, no, no, it just keeps getting worse.
it's so it's this headline was in a few different trades, one being the Hollywood Reporter, the other actually was the New York Post, but it was about Allen Media Group, which
Mm-hmm.
is owned by Byron Allen. Um,
Noted
and
billionaire.
correct. So basically, it's saying that there are layoffs at the media company this week will affect around 300 employees across its operating divisions, representing 12% of the company's workforce of 2,500. Um, and the job cuts will affect places like, I guess, Weather Channel, or at least the job cuts at Alameda, which operates the Weather Channel and 12 other cable networks. Um, and they're saying that this is, of course, something that's needed for the company to move forward. We'll
That's
see
what
what
everybody
happens.
says.
Exactly. I mean,
I was thinking the other day that I was just like, oh my God, we keep starting with all of these, like, really depressing stats and more layoffs or whatever. But at the same time, there was, I think I might have seen a comment or something. It's probably on Twitter because that's where all joy goes to die. And somebody was like, oh, like it's not really that bad. And like, actually, no, there is a legit crisis in journalism.
right.
So that reminded me that I was just like, yeah, no, there's actually a purpose to this.
I yeah. Listen, and I do believe it isn't just journalism. We're seeing also
Oh,
places like in media in
absolutely.
general
God forbid
where
if you work in entertainment.
there's just a shift happening, and I that's the thing that kind of forces you to kind of, for a lot of us, is reevaluating what we're doing. How do we operate? How do you look for jobs? There are a lot of things that are, I think it's pushing us to think differently about what's happening. So
Mm-hmm.
um, I agree. So there was a more positive story
Mm-hmm.
here was actually about the Pulitzers. So the Pulitzer Prizes in journalism were awarded, um, and this was an article from AP. So the New York Times and Washington Post were awarded three Pulitzer Prizes apiece on Monday for work in 2023 that dealt with everything from the war in Gaza to gun violence. The Associated Press won in the feature photography category for coverage of global migration in the US. What was interesting, there was a couple of local shout outs. They say the staff of Lookout Santa Cruz in California won a Pulitzer in breaking news reporting for what the prize board called nimble, community minded coverage of flooding and mudslides. That was a huge
Okay.
issue in 2023. Um, in local reporting, Sarah Conway of City Bureau and Trina Reynolds Tyler of the Invisible Institute won for investigative series on missing Black girls and women in Chicago, and how
Super important
racism
subject.
and the police response contributed to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think this was interesting too, though. The Pulitzers also announced that five of the 45 finalists this year used artificial intelligence in research and reporting of their submissions. It was the first time the board required applicants for the award to disclose the use of AI, which I think is really interesting in terms of where we're moving in terms of AI, the impact it's having on
A lot of people
journalism.
have said it's here to stay. It's not a question of like, oh, how do we fight against it? No, it is. It is. And you either learn to work with it.
Exactly. You just see, like any type of new technology, it's something that we are just going to have to learn how how do we use it? And I think transparency of
Yes,
what
I think
is
that's
being,
super important.
so people know. I know they use that in terms of speech, when they're using that. Is something that is may know when you go on certain websites and the whole text to speech uh, issue. So yeah, so that is
My
that was
only
a
question
positive.
or concern about and I guess we'll have to figure out a way to discuss this, but about the use of AI and the transparency, again, it's honor system. And
Right.
not everybody's got the same scruples.
Well, that's where I think but that's always going to be, I think, the case with this. It's so easy to hide in many ways. Like not everybody is going to know it's something that you are. You're it's kind of the honor system. You're
Yeah,
hoping people are going to be the
exactly.
ones to tell you that, but um like you said, it's here to stay, and there's lots of stories I'm seeing where people are using it. There was a story about someone using it to frame somebody else in terms of something they said, and they were able to manipulate their audio. Um, but
The
this is
urge
what's
to get
happening.
over. Anyway,
I know.
one last headline. This isn't so
Yeah.
much of a headline. It's more of a shout out and a super congratulations. So, of course, I had mentioned before that the radio reporting that the kids were doing, or excuse me, the young adults,
Yes.
the student journalists were doing at Columbia about their own community was absolutely stellar. Well, they have gone even further, and the Columbia Spectator, the student newspaper, it partnered basically with New York Magazine, and they did a full, like, they got the front cover and a full spread about art called Our Campus, Our Crisis. And I haven't been able to read through the whole thing. I just started it, but I just want to say that I am super duper impressed. And my hope for these student journalists is that once they graduate with their graduate degrees, that they are able to step into a field that can support them to continue to grow, because there's nothing
Hmm.
but Pulitzer Prize winners in this group.
Hmm. I agree. They did a great job. I was listening to their uh some interviews they posted online. It was just really solid journalism
Yeah.
and committed for it. So totally.
All right. Well, anyway,
All right.
pew pew pew. Go Columbia. Columbia J School. And J schools everywhere, I should say, because they're not the only ones that are doing the work. There are a lot of journalism programs that are putting in the work and actually filling in some of the local news gaps. So kudos to all of them.
Sounds good. Do you
All
want to head
right.
to our interview?
Yeah, let's get to our interview. When news organizations began contracting and in some cases completely shutting down, laying off hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists, the only way to keep up with how many people were affected was social media feeds, which one journalist described as little more than a platform for journalists to announce that they are now unemployed. So, Katherine Reynolds Lewis, an award winning science journalist, author, speaker, and founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, wanted to know more. She put her data mining skills to work and created the Census of laid off journalists to find out which demographics of journalists were getting laid off and what could that mean for the health of the industry. And we'd like to welcome Katherine to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Great to be here.
Oh, it's so great to have you. I was so thrilled when I saw that this um, census was even happening, because it really did sort of feel, especially when we were laid off at the end of 23, that I don't know, it was just a sort of vacuum that nobody cared what was happening. But tell me why you decided to create this census, and why was it important to get this snapshot of what was going on within the news media industry?
I personally just have become so frustrated seeing talented colleagues get laid off and leave journalism. And I know there's a lot of talent leaving our newsrooms and potentially leaving our industry. And some of the initiatives that had been ongoing to capture the diversity, in particular, of our journalism workforce have been discontinued. So I really wanted to know what the impact was going to be, especially in an election year when it's really important that we have a robust cohort in the journalism workforce covering the elections and holding our leaders accountable. And as you two know, I also have been through a mass layoff. Both sides are traumatized, right? From whether you lost your job or whether you're the 70% of the folks who are left in the newsroom, it's much harder for all of us to do our jobs when we don't know if we're going to have them next week.
Well, have you gotten any preliminary data yet?
We've received about 170 responses. We're hoping to do a full analysis next month. So would love for more journalists who are laid off or bought out to answer the survey. It's only about 5 or 7 minutes long. Or if you know someone who was laid off, please send it to them. We have noticed that the biggest single chunk of folks leaving in terms of trends is sort of that early to mid career stage, people with 5 to 15 years of experience who are in that sort of sweet spot of your career where you know what you're doing, you're good at your job, and you're really in the trenches. You're not quite in management or upper management. So you have a lot to contribute. So that's the part that concerns me just preliminarily, that we're losing this really valuable swath of journalists.
I mean, Catherine, what do you think is like, what's the impact of what you're learning so far? Like, when you say that, like, what's the concern with that? What implications does that mean?
Well, for me, it just feels so urgent because I've been a journalist for 20 years and I've just seen wave after wave of layoffs. And every time a group of people leaves a newsroom or leaves journalism, we're missing them, right? We miss their talent, we miss their institutional knowledge. And in a particular newsroom, we count on those folks who are either senior reporters or junior editors, often, who are mentoring and advising the folks who are coming into news organizations. And it's a lot of these informal ways of sharing knowledge and sharing best practices are going to be missing from our newsrooms. And I know when I was an early journalist, I learned so much from sitting in a newsroom next to folks who were 10 years ahead of me or 15 years ahead of me in their careers. I heard their phone calls with sources. I got to observe how they did their jobs, how they negotiated with editors, the things that pissed them off, and that's the kind of intangible knowledge you just can't convey if those people are no longer sitting side by side or in a Zoom room or on Slack with us anymore.
Well, I want to kind of go back to one of the other things you were talking about, diversifying newsrooms. Is there any kind of indication of and I'm not saying that, listen, budgets are budgets and numbers are numbers, but is there any indication of how many journalists of color are being basically forced out or pushed out?
Well, there's been really great reporting on particular cases. Like what comes to mind is the Los Angeles Times really having a huge impact on their, affinity groups of Black and Hispanic and Asian journalists in that newsroom. So I think there's a lot of case studies that already have been well covered. Um, so far, we haven't done a deep dive into the racial diversity, but it seems like one of the things that gives us some confidence in our data is that we're seeing results that kind of mirror the general demographics of journalists overall. So that helps us believe this is a somewhat representative sample, although it's sort of early yet. 20 years ago, when I was the DC chapter president of the Asian American Journalists Association, my colleague Mei-Ling Hopgood started a survey of the diversity of Washington, D.C. newsrooms. And at that time, I thought, oh, this is so great. We're going to be having real data. And, when newsrooms, put these accountability goals out there, we'll be able to hold them accountable, such as, at one point, the News Leaders Association wanted to have the demographics of journalism newsrooms to be the same as the demographics of this country by 2025. That would be next year. So we're not at that goal, and it's sad to me how few initiatives like that have come up over the years. Although I would certainly point to the Levers survey by Carla Murphy, which gave a really in-depth qualitative picture of why Black journalists in particular leave newsrooms, and Meredith Clark's work with the now called the News Leaders Association on surveying newsrooms. It's a voluntary survey, so unfortunately they were forced to discontinue it in 2018 because they weren't getting enough results from newsrooms to have statistically significant results. So I see all these initiatives that when they came out, I thought, oh great, we're finally going to have some good data on demographics in our newsrooms, and not just race, but all the identifiers and the social identities that we would want to know about. And none of those have really been sustained. So one of the reasons the Institute for Independent Journalists Foundation launched this survey was that we wanted to at least put a small stake in the ground, building on those prior efforts to have some data that I hope we can then build on to get a better picture of, are our newsrooms reflecting the communities that they cover, right? In all aspects of whatever diversity means to you. And I'm hopeful that if we can get enough people to answer the survey, we'll really begin to have something to build on and then continue, so that we have some continuity of information about who are the people reporting the news in communities around America.
I have a follow-up to that, because even though you've mentioned with these other initiatives to increase diversity and to make sure that newsrooms reflect the communities that they're covering, and there's been so many other things, but at the same time, we've also seen how sometimes leadership can sign on at the beginning, but then, actually, we don't necessarily need this, and change their mind somewhere later on. So is there, first of all, I understand right now this is just a census, but is there anything that, I don't know, either journalists or people who are consuming media can basically do to try to hold on to this, to say, actually, the best person to come into our community and cover it is somebody who's from our community? Is there any way, I guess, to try to like really push the issue? Because it seems very flexible, especially right now.
Well, that's a great question. Certainly, I'm excited by the number of new startup newsrooms in underserved communities that haven't been well covered. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of those newsrooms are successful is that often they're like one or two person newsroom. They're well known in the community, they're of and from the community, so they are trusted. And so I would say to communities that feel they're getting bad coverage, start your own news organization, or give the good stories to the folks who are doing the best work covering your communities. And I do have optimism that good coverage rises to the top, that the folks who are doing good work will engage with audiences, will have the credibility to then build on that good work. And I do think also we should look back at, the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered and there was this rise of anti-Asian hate, and news organizations, as many corporations did across the country, made all these pledges. They hired folks in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging roles. And I do think in 2022, and again last year, we saw some of those roles quietly or more loudly disappear. And I do think communities should hold their news organizations accountable for that kind of decision. So when there's a big announcement, follow up, right? It's sort of the job of the reporter. 2 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, what's happened? What's changed? Are you meeting the goals that you claimed to want to meet in those moments of crisis?
Catherine, one thing, just looking back at the survey, and um, we not long ago we actually we featured one of your articles on Neiman Lamps as part of our headline, and it was about the issue of leaving journalism, and it was how you don't like the term leaving journalism, and just rereading a little bit of what you had written was underlying the notion of leaving journalism as a momentous decision is the belief that journalists are rarefied ethical beings who aren't tainted by commercial motives. But when we start to think of ourselves as precious, a few bad things happen. Can you explain a little bit about what are some of those, bad things that could happen, and also why you're not, you're keen on the term leaving journalism.
Yeah, well, for folks who have been laid off or lost their job for another reason, there often seems to be this fraught decision. Do I leave journalism? Do I take a non-journalism job as if it were a one-way street? And it's there's enough pressure already on folks who are job hunting without adding this, monumental notion that you can't ever go back. So number one, you can go back. I have so many colleagues who have dipped out of journalism for a time and then come back in or taken a full-time job that's not journalism work, but freelance on the side. And as long as there's no conflicts in what they're doing, I think that's a great model for folks who want to stay active and contribute to journalism while putting bread on the table. And in terms of the dynamic that I think this preciousness sets up, we as journalists, I take a lot of pride in my work and I adhere to my ethical standards. And at the same time, I always want to keep the curiosity and the beginner's mind and the open mind that I could be wrong, that a source may or a community may have something to teach me that I didn't know going into reporting. And when we start to think of ourselves as superior or precious or this cast of professionals who are the only ones who can do this thing, then we're setting up a distance between ourselves and the communities we cover, our audiences, the folks that we need to engage in our work and learn from, right? So I think treating everyone with respect and equality in the news gathering process and the dissemination process is really vital to the production of good journalism. And when we start to have this superior inferior dynamic, where someone crosses over to the dark side and they're working in PR. And I have friends who are working in communications for human rights organizations and child welfare organizations. Like, that is not a dark side. They're just doing a different part of the job. And obviously, there are times when we're adversarial, but we also need to maintain that fundamental respect and equality, in my opinion, because that's how we can do our jobs best.
It's interesting because as I hear what you're saying, and we've spoken to a few people who have basically echoed a similar sentiment. And on one hand, there is a part of my brain that hears it and comprehends it. But because journalism can be so competitive, it can be hard to digest it. It's just one of those weird, I guess, balancing acts of the career path. But I also did want to go back and ask you, going back to the census, for someone who maybe they haven't heard about this, maybe they've seen it online or something, but they're like, I don't really know. Like, one of the other things that we've also talked about is the fact that we treat unemployment as if it's a 4-letter word. So sometimes people don't want to engage in anything that further underlines this godforsaken situation that they're in. How would you convince somebody, or what would you tell a journalist who really should help, boost this census and participate, but is maybe feeling on the fence because this is enough that I've been laid off. I really don't want to talk about it.
Right. Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to pressure anyone. I would say, please bookmark it, come back to it maybe when it's a little less raw. But honestly, I think the best words come from the folks who have already responded. And we had so many notes at the end of the survey saying, thank you for giving me a space to share my story. Thank you for trying to help us understand what's happening to our industry better. And I think all of us who love journalism see we're in a crisis right now. The business model is broken. News leaders do not know how to fix it. There are very few news organizations that can confidently say, I'm stable, I know where my revenue streams are going to come for the next 3 years, much less 10. So this is a small effort that I hope everyone can contribute to give us a little bit more information that will, I hope, make journalism stronger, better, more durable, and more diverse and more representative of the communities that we're seeking to cover.
So, and Catherine, where can people find the census? Like, where is it that they can find this? And we'll be sure to
On
include it in
our
our census form, and we'll be sure to
Yes,
include it on
yes,
our notes.
our website, the Institute for Independent Journalists, is iij.com. And if you /census, that will be the easiest place to find it, or all of our social medias. And we also, have a ton of resources for freelance journalists. That is our core mission, is the emotional and financial sustainability of independent journalists with a focus on journalists of color. So for folks who have been laid off and want to know how to price a gig, or they get offered something and they don't know if it's a good rate, we hope to serve you as well. We've got lots of free webinars and resources on the website as well. And just getting back to what Jenna, you said about competition and how competitive this industry is. As a science journalist, I love the huge body of research that shows we are at our best when we are tending to our own needs, physical, emotional, spiritual, when we are at our best, job hunting or doing our work or being with our family or pursuing our interests, is when we're getting enough sleep, when we are giving ourselves breaks and rest, when we are treating ourselves with self-compassion rather than insecurity or that edge of like, oh, if I don't take this, someone else will, they'll get ahead of me. And I think again, I would say that in capitalism, leaders of big organizations have an incentive to make us feel insecure and desperate and needy. But it's not what's right for us. So whatever we can do to fill our own buckets, and that is time away from the job hunt or whatever, that's good in the long run, because this is a marathon. We are information workers. I hope we will all be at it for 70, 80 years, at whatever pace we want to be. And so we need to pace ourselves and fill ourselves up, since this industry isn't necessarily going to do it for us.
It's
Fair
interesting you
enough.
bring that up though, Catherine, though. Like, what about for people who are so identified with being journalists? Because that's a part of this job, is the fact that we are so passionate and we are so invested in telling these stories. So sometimes when you could hear, yes, we can just choose another job, try something else, but sometimes that can really hurt, because you're like, but I have a voice, I have something I want to share. So how do you address that part of it when it isn't just like, it's more of like it hurts to not be the person telling that story?
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. I think first feel it. It's real. It's okay to feel that loss, and it may have to look different in the future for you or for a time, right? We have phases in our career. And if that's something that was really valuable to you, you don't have to shed that identity. When people introduce themselves to me as a former journalist, often after I hear a bit about what they're doing, I say, sounds like you're still doing journalism. Maybe it's internal journalism, maybe it's storytelling for an organization, maybe it's providing information to your community as a volunteer. But in some way, it seems like you're still connected to those values. And I don't think you need to take off that mantle of journalist unless you really want to. I would embrace a big, broad definition of journalism, because those of us, the shrinking group of us who have the standards and the practices and know how to use the tools of journalism, use them in whatever ways we can, and teach other people, because it needs to be continued as a practice.
Well, I do want to just pivot real quickly to the IIJ, or the Institute for Independent Journalists, and just tell us a little bit about why you founded that institution. I mean, you sort of touched on it, but that feels like, again, a very unique space that most people kind of dismiss, like, oh, you're all freelance and you're all floating around on your own. It's worth creating community around being an independent journalist.
Yes, thank you for that question. I remember going to an Asian American Journalists Association convention soon after I was laid off and when I started my freelance career. And I ran into an old colleague and she said, oh, it's great to see you. What have you been up to? And I said, oh, I'm freelancing now. And her face fell. She was like, oh, I'm sorry. And I realized it was code for unemployed, right? The same way that you said that there's this stigma. And again, I want to shed all that stigma of freelancing, of being unemployed, of taking a break. All of those are important parts of everyone's career path. So instead, I wanted to have a space where we wouldn't get those kind of reactions, where where it's buy-in for freelancers of color, where we can share community and find resources. And the immediate impetus for it was in 2020. I actually wrote a book in 2018, and in 2019, half of my freelance income came from speaking to large ballrooms of people. So in March 2020, all that income came to a crashing halt. So
Mm.
I was looking for ways to sustain myself and stay in journalism and continue doing the reporting that I thought mattered. And I reached out to other colleagues who were long form narrative journalists just to try to get support for myself, and started a Zoom group every month. And then some of them invited their friends and colleagues. It ended up being all women of color, I think, just because that's my network. I'm biracial, I'm white and Chinese. And I think also the stories that I cover often folks of color covering those beats. So in those meetings, after just a few months, I realized I have been a full-time freelance journalist making a very good living, winning awards, feeling like I was on top of my game. And I was still learning new things every month. So I decided we shouldn't just have this wisdom passed around in Zoom rooms or one-on-one coffees with your colleagues. We need to make it available and free and open, and everyone to know how to sustain themselves as a freelancer. I really believe the future of journalism is freelance already. A third of journalists are freelancers, and I am predicting that number will grow, especially as our youngest journalists have a strong desire to be entrepreneurs and to be independent. So we need to have a thriving cohort of sustainable freelancers who are not just going to be exploited by media organizations, who do good work and follow journalistic practices so that editors are confident in hiring them, our producers are confident in assigning work to them. And for me, it was that space that I was missing in my own career. That I love AAJA, but it really is about building a career in a newsroom. And there are a number of, maybe two or three wonderful groups for freelancers, but either they're not really focused on journalism, it's sort of broadly writing, or it's predominantly white institutions. So I wanted to have this space that really intersected. And for us, one of the other great things that has come out of having, at least 8 or 9 free webinars every year and an annual conference is we feature and highlight every year close to 80 speakers and moderators of color. So it makes it harder and harder for newsrooms to say, well, I couldn't find anyone for that job, or for assigning editors
We've
to say,
got
well,
this
I just
whole
don't.
roster.
Exactly. Go on our website. Please feel free to poach our talent. We want, and I've heard from folks, after appearing in our conference or one of our webinars, they get assignments or they get opportunities. And that's the kind of space that we wanted to create, where not only are we sharing wisdom, we're also lifting up our community, making everyone more connected. And myself, after 15 years as a full-time independent journalist, people think it's the finances that's hard, but it's really waking up every morning and making the magic happen yourself, and looking in the mirror and saying, I'm smart enough, I'm good enough, people like me. And so that's what we try to do for each other at the IIJ.
Well, lastly, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. And well, one question we ask all our guests are, how did you become a journalist? What drew you to this field?
Well, I've always loved writing and reading. So that was a constant from when I was a child. But throughout high school, I was raised by a feminist immigrant mom who always said, you're good at math, you're good at science. So I spent most of college trying to figure out which field of physics was I going to get a PhD in. And by my senior year, I realized I did not want to be a laboratory scientist. So I went back to the love of storytelling, and got a job in journalism covering actually business news, because that's where the jobs were. And over the course of my career, have gravitated back towards science. And really, what I love about journalism is I get to learn something new every day and share it with the world, or whatever part of the world consumes my journalism. And I hope that I make a difference. When I wrote my book, my literary agent said he still believes that books change people's lives. And I do believe journalism changes people's lives. It's news and information that makes people have better, more enriched, safer, healthier lives, that strengthens our communities, that sustains our democracy. I mean, I just love it all.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to leave it. But Katherine, thank you so much for taking time to join us on Laid Off and Looking. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you both so much for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so Dom, this week I've got a spotlight. And even though I know that we have said that we're not going to do everything about our own backyard, New York City, it's sometimes hard. There's a lot of news here.
Yes.
And so one of the independent news outlets that came into existence when a bunch of other journalists needed a outlet to continue to work and create for and report for, more importantly, is Hellgate, named after the infamous island that I think was a prison back in the day. I don't know my New York City history that well. Shame on me. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that amongst the many works that they do, and I follow them online, and they have a lot of great work, but one that really caught my attention is every New Yorker's favorite topic, affordable housing. Uh,
Oh,
exactly.
oh boy. Go
Or
ahead.
the lack thereof.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and this, by the way, I know that this applies everywhere, but it is like if you go to any sort of social gathering of New Yorkers, I guarantee the conversation is going to turn to housing somehow.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, so Hellgate did a report why affordable housing is rarely affordable in New York City. And the subheadline is there's a need for affordable housing at a range of income levels, but let's not kid ourselves. The programs we have today don't reach most of the people who need them. Finally, someone speaks the truth. This piece is by Esther Wang. And so I read through it. I'm not going to read through the whole thing because I would really encourage you to go to Hellgate and read her piece. But basically, it attempts to answer the question, what even is affordable housing? And that's one of the subjects that I feel like when the debate happens, the drilling down to that detail of what is affordable housing is a really important thing because that's going to vary from person to person. What somebody who, lives in a classic six on the Upper East Side thinks is affordable versus somebody who's like,
Totally.
working a wage job in the Bronx is going to, like, we're talking night and day.
Totally.
Yeah. So, and I learned several things from this.
What did you
So
learn?
let's see. I learned that as of New York's budget, New York State now has something called good cause eviction laws, which basically they limit the evictions or the number of evictions. That's what the law is intended to do, to limit the number of evictions by requiring lease renewals, yay, capping rent increases, yay,
Oh,
for most of the market rate apartments in New York City and other municipalities across the state. So even smaller cities, I'm using air quotes, like in the Hudson Valley, this has been an issue definitely in your Kingston, your Beacon, and now your Newburgh and Poughkeepsie. Okay. First of all, thoughts just from you on that.
uh, thoughts in terms of,
Well, just in terms of good cause eviction that we now
I
have,
think
like,
it's, I think that's amazing. I
right?
think it's
And
amazing
it's
that
kind of
there's
like a finally
protections.
moment. Yes.
Yeah, there's protection for us. You know what I mean? Like that's such a huge thing to have of in terms of being able to like, yeah, totally.
Okay. So moving on. However, because of course this is Albany, so there's a however, it exempts the good cause eviction, according to this article, exempts small landlords, which the state defines as someone who owns basically under 10 apartments. That
Okay.
makes you a small landlord. Now, of course, again, you're weighing this against like, um multinational like conglomerate companies that own thousands of apartments. If you only own 10, then yeah, you're small by comparison. Um, so let's see. So it exempts small landlords, and it also extended and created some tax breaks. I'm not going to get into the tax breaks because the article does an amazing job of breaking them down, but tax breaks that developers get to build affordable housing. And
Hmm.
apparently, this is something that I had missed in this storyline, that those tax breaks are based on, excuse me, the number of affordable housing units are based on the median income of a given area. And that median income is a number set by the federal government, not local city government, which again, I was like, that exactly that face you're making, that was my response. I was like, but y'all don't live
What?
here. I mean,
Yeah. Now we went back to federal for that. Okay.
exactly. We
Usually it's
would
always like it's all about the local. Okay. Sure.
again, this is just the compromise that was reached. Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, but the article really is, and I strongly encourage people to read it because it's a very comprehensive breakdown of something called New York City's AMI. Dom, have you heard of an AMI before?
No.
I
No,
had
I have
not heard
not.
of an AMI either. AMI is kind of referring to what I said before, area median income, and it's how developers basically exchange a handful of affordable properties for some pretty sweet tax breaks. So, yeah, like I'm not sure how much this is really helping because again, finding affordable housing is just so incredibly difficult, especially in an expensive city like New York. Um, and one of the other things that the article points out is that the API, as determined
Mm,
for, I guess, various areas in New York City, um, the median renter, and that's something else that I loved about this article was that it consistently referred to the median, not the average. Something else that I think people sometimes confuse. Average, people. Quick math lesson. This much I remember from my early days in journalism. Okay, so average means you take all the numbers together and then you divide them by the number of like people, so to speak. So if
right.
you have like, I don't know, 10 people who all make like 50 to 70 grand a year, and then you include one billionaire, well, the average now
Right.
is going to make everybody's income look way higher. So no, 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 no. The median is where most people's income is. That's more of the 50 to 70 grand. Anyway, the average renter is making about 60% of the federally determined AMI or area median income. And I thought that was really like, okay, so it feels like you're acknowledging there's a problem, but we're still
Right.
not fixing it.
Well, you know, that's the problem where a lot of New Yorkers who, we work everyday jobs and you can't afford to live in the city. And that's why people move out of New York sometimes, move to
Holla.
whether it's Jersey or out of the city. Um, and your transit is now instead of like 30 minutes, you're talking about hour and a half, 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing I think where people are looking for a different way of living, but it's another thing if you cannot afford to live in the area you work in or even nearby. So that's something I think that certainly definitely needs to be addressed. I'm curious to see how this all kind of how it I mean, it feels good that it sounds good that there's some kind of they're trying something. I'm just curious, like you just said, like right there, that's a little bit of a red flag in terms of 60% of the
60%,
federally
yeah.
determined, yeah, AMI. Just it's like, okay, I guess we shall see how that really works.
I mean, okay, I
Is that
guess.
really creating better affordable housing opportunities, or is it not?
Well, exactly. I think, and that's the point is that there still isn't enough.
Hmm.
But yeah,
Great
so
article.
that's our
That's a
show
great.
this week.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. All right, Jen, I'll
Absolutely,
see you
yeah.
next week.
See you next week, Dom.
Bye.
Bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.